The stagecoach rattled into Redemption, Montana territory, its wheels kicking up a cloud of ochre dust that settled like a bitter shroud over Hannah Lawson's already weary spirit. For weeks, the rhythmic sway and jolting discomfort had been her constant companions, a physical manifestation of the uncertain journey she'd undertaken. Clutched in her hand was a worn letter, the ink slightly blurred from anxious readings promising a new life, a home, a husband, Mr. Edgar Grumbles, proprietor of Grumbles Mercantile. Hannah, a woman whose quiet strength was too often mistaken for meekness, had dared to hope this remote corner of the world might offer a solace her past had denied. As she stepped down, her dark, travel-stained dress a stark contrast to the raucous, sun-bleached boardwalk, a wave of apprehension washed over her. Redemption was rougher than she'd imagined, its raw, timbered buildings leaning like tired old men. Her eyes scanned the small crowd, searching for the man whose carefully penned, if somewhat stilted, letters had painted a picture of modest prosperity and a desire for companionship. A portly man with a florid face and a waistcoat straining across his considerable middle pushed his way forward. His gaze, however, wasn't one of welcome. It swept over Hannah, lingered on the rich, deep hue of her skin, and then contorted into a sneer of profound distaste. This was Edgar Grumbles. "You're Hannah Lawson?" he stammered, his voice loud enough for the curious onlookers to hear. His initial surprise curdled into outrage. "The agent didn't specify. I wasn't expecting." He gestured vaguely, his face reddening further. Hannah straightened, her chin lifting almost imperceptibly. "I am Hannah Lawson, Mr. Grumbles, as per our correspondence." Her voice was low, but steady, a melody of resilience in the harsh cacophony of his disdain. Grumbles puffed himself up, his small eyes darting around at the gathering crowd, clearly more concerned with their judgment than her dignity. "Well, there's been a mistake. A terrible mistake. This won't do at all. I won't." He waved a dismissive hand. "You are not what I was led to expect. You are unsuitable." The word unsuitable, delivered with such public venom, struck Hannah with the force of a physical blow, yet her composure remained. The stares of the townspeople, a mixture of cruel amusement and cold indifference, pricked at her. Humiliation, hot and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her, but years of navigating a world that often saw her as less than had forged an iron will within her. "Mr. Grumbles," she said, her voice retaining its calm, though a tremor now laced it, "I have traveled a great distance based on your written word, and the payment made to the bridal agency. I have your letters. Letters can be misinterpreted." Grumbles blustered, clearly flustered but unwilling to yield. "The arrangement is void. Find your own way. I'll not have it said that Edgar Grumbles was tricked." With that, he turned on his heel and stomped back towards his mercantile, leaving Hannah standing alone, her few belongings at her feet, the dust of redemption settling upon her like a final, cruel taunt. The hope that had sustained her through the arduous journey crumbled, leaving only the raw ache of rejection and the terrifying uncertainty of her situation. Stranded, penniless, and marked by the color of her skin in a town that had already judged her, Hannah Lawson drew a slow, deliberate breath. Her gaze, though shadowed with pain, held a flicker of an unyielding spirit. She would not break. Not here. Not now. From the shaded veranda of the land office across the street, a tall figure had observed the entire exchange. Josiah McBride, owner of the sprawling Arrowwood ranch, and a man of considerable, if quietly wielded, influence, watched Grumbles' retreating form with a look of cool contempt. His gaze then shifted to the lone woman, noting the quiet dignity with which she bore such a public humiliation. He saw not the unsuitability Grumbles had proclaimed, but a resilience that resonated with something deep within his own solitary nature. For now, however, he remained in the shadows, a silent witness to the bitter arrival. The sun began to dip towards the jagged peaks in the west, and Hannah knew she had to find shelter, any shelter, before nightfall claimed redemption. The hours that followed Edgar Grumbles' brutal dismissal were a blur of closed doors and thinly veiled contempt for Hannah Lawson. Redemption, it seemed, had already passed its verdict, siding with one of its own, however boorish. Shopkeepers mumbled about having no work. Boarding house matrons declared themselves full, their eyes mirroring the prejudice that had left Hannah stranded. Leading the chorus of disapproval was Mrs. Millicent Thorne, a woman whose rigid posture and pursed lips broadcast her self-appointed role as the town's moral guardian. Her whispers followed Hannah like a chill wind, poisoning any well of sympathy before Hannah could even approach it. An affront. Mrs. Thorne was heard declaring to a group of women near the dry goods store to expect to integrate into respectable society under such false pretenses. Dejection gnawed at Hannah, but her spirit, though battered, refused to break. If the heart of redemption was cold, perhaps its outskirts would offer a sliver of opportunity. With her small bag in hand, she walked, her steps taking her away from the main thoroughfare, past the last of the ramshackle houses, towards the open country, where the vast Montana sky seemed to promise a space less confining than the town's narrow judgments. She inquired at a small, struggling farm, offering to trade labor for a meal and a place in a barn, but was met with a wary refusal. It was as she skirted the edge of a large, fenced property, the Arrowwood Ranch, according to a weathered sign, that a minor incident unfolded. A young colt, spooked by a tumbleweed, skittering across the track, reared, its eyes wide with panic. The ranch hand struggling with its lead rope was being pulled dangerously off balance. Without a second thought, Hannah set down her bag. Her voice, calm and soothing, carried over the wind. "Easy now, easy," she murmured, approaching slowly, her movements unthreatening. She began to hum a low, gentle melody, something her grandmother had used to calm agitated animals. The colt's ears twitched. It stilled, its gaze fixing on her. She continued to speak softly, her presence exuding a quiet confidence that seemed to absorb the animal's fear. Within moments, the colt stood trembling but quiet, allowing the relieved ranch hand to regain control. Josiah McBride, mounted on a powerful bay gelding on a nearby rise, had witnessed the entire interaction. He'd been tracking a stray calf, but his attention had been drawn to the lone figure walking the perimeter of his land, and then to her remarkable handling of the spooked colt. He'd seen her arrival in town the day before, the ugly scene with Grumbles. He was a man of few words, a widower whose wealth and isolated ranch had made him an enigmatic figure to most in redemption. He valued competence and honesty above all else, and had little patience for the pettiness he often observed in town, particularly from the likes of Grumbles and Mrs. Thorne. He rode down towards Hannah, his expression unreadable. The ranch hand, recognizing his employer, touched his hat. "Mr. McBride, sir." Josiah nodded, his keen blue eyes assessing Hannah. "That was well done," he said, his voice a low baritone. "You have a way with horses." Hannah met his gaze directly. "I've been around animals most of my life, sir." "You're the woman Mr. Grumbles was expecting," he stated, not unkindly. A faint flush rose on Hannah's cheeks, but her voice remained even. "I am." It seems I was not to his satisfaction. Josiah McBride considered her for a long moment. His ranch was vast, his household needing more than the aging couple who currently managed it could provide. His prized gardens, once his late wife's pride, were becoming overgrown, and some of his newer livestock, imported at great expense, seemed to be ailing despite the veterinarian's efforts. He saw not a rejected male, order bride, but a woman of composure and, perhaps, untapped skill. And if he were honest, the thought of discomfiting Grumbles and Mrs. Thorne held a certain appeal. "My housekeeper, Martha, could use some help in the main house and with the kitchen gardens," he said, his tone strictly business. "And some of my stock. They've not been thriving. I'm offering a trial position. Hard work, fair pay, room and board. If you prove capable." Hannah's breath caught. "An offer, a genuine offer. Not charity, but a chance to prove her worth." The town's shock, she knew, would be palpable. But in Josiah McBride's direct gaze, she saw not prejudice, but a flicker of something akin to respect. "I am a hard worker, Mr. McBride," she said, a spark of hope rekindling in her eyes. "I would be grateful for the opportunity." "Get your bag," he said, turning his horse. "The ranch house is this way." As Hannah Lawson followed Josiah McBride towards the sprawling heart of the Arrowwood ranch, she knew the whispers in redemption would only intensify. But for the first time since her arrival, a fragile sense of possibility began to take root in her weary soul. She had found an unexpected refuge. The Arrowwood Ranch was a world unto itself, a sprawling domain of rolling grasslands, timbered hills, and carefully irrigated fields that stood in stark contrast to the parched, haphazard development of redemption. The main house, a sturdy two-story timber and stone structure, spoke of quiet prosperity rather than ostentatious wealth. For Hannah Lawson, it was an island of surprising sanctuary, though not without its undercurrents. Martha, Josiah McBride's housekeeper, was a woman whose initial skepticism was as starched as her apron. Yet, Hannah's quiet diligence and gentle demeanor began to soften her. Hannah didn't just clean, she brought a sense of order and subtle warmth to the rooms. It was in the kitchen gardens, however, and among the ailing livestock, that her true talents began to shine. The gardens, neglected since Mrs. McBride's passing, were a tangle of weeds and struggling plants. Hannah, drawing on knowledge passed down from her grandmother, a woman whose hands could coax life from the most stubborn soil, set to work with a quiet passion. She identified plants that needed separating, enriched the soil with compost she started herself, and seemed to understand instinctively what each struggling shoot required. Within weeks, a section of the garden began to show vibrant new growth, promising a bounty Martha hadn't seen in years. Her touch with animals was equally remarkable. Several of Josiah's expensive new lambs had been listless, refusing to thrive. The local veterinarian had been dismissive, blaming the journey or a vague weakness of constitution. Hannah, observing them closely, noticed subtle signs, a slight cloudiness in their eyes, a particular quality to their cough that others had missed. She prepared a poultice from herbs she found growing near the creek, and a special mash supplemented with wild greens she knew to be fortifying. Slowly, painstakingly, the lambs began to improve, their energy returning, their coats regaining their luster. Josiah McBride, a man of keen observation, missed none of this. He said little, his reserved nature a deeply ingrained habit, but his eyes followed Hannah as she worked. He saw the way she moved with a quiet purpose, the intelligence in her gentle hands, the genuine concern she showed for every living thing under her care. His initial offer, perhaps made partly on impulse and a desire to thwart redemption's petty tyrants, was looking more like a shrewd decision with each passing day. His respect for her grew, an unspoken acknowledgment of her inherent worth. Meanwhile, in redemption, the whispers intensified. Edgar Grumbles, his pride still smarting, fueled the gossip, painting Hannah as an adventuress who had somehow duped the reclusive McBride. Mark my words. He'd declare in his mercantile, no good will come of it. She's put some kind of spell on him or on those animals. It ain't natural. Mrs. Millicent Thorne took a more sanctimonious approach. It's a disgrace. She'd pronounce at the church sewing circle. Mr. McBride, a man of his standing, harboring such a woman. What example does it set? And her meddling with plants and livestock, it smacks of folk remedies, best left in the dark ages. Behind the scenes, Mrs. Thorne was beginning to consider more direct action. She envisioned rallying the more concerned citizens, perhaps even appealing to the territorial marshal about the irregularities at the Arrowwood. What Grumbles and Mrs. Thorne didn't realize was that Josiah McBride was becoming increasingly aware of their machinations. He had his own sources of information in town, and their malicious gossip only solidified his resolve to protect Hannah and give her a fair chance. He also knew Grumbles was a swindler in his own right, often overcharging for goods of questionable quality. Silas had been biding his time on that front, but the merchant's blatant cruelty towards Hannah had moved him up the list of men deserving of a reckoning. One evening, as Hannah was tending a particularly stubborn rosebush his late wife had planted, Josiah approached. "The gardens haven't looked this promising in years, Hannah," he said, his voice softer than usual. And the lambs, the vet was surprised by their recovery. Hannah looked up, a smudge of soil on her cheek. "They just needed the right kind of care, Mr. McBride. Sometimes the old ways understand things the new ways overlook." A flicker of a smile touched Josiah's lips. "It seems you understand a great many things, Hannah Lawson." In that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition of skills valued, and a sanctuary slowly solidifying against the tide of outside prejudice. But the storm clouds of resentment were gathering in redemption, and Hannah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her peace was fragile, her wonders still vulnerable to the whispers of the world outside Arrowwood's gates. The late summer air, usually alive with the hum of insects and the scent of ripening crops, grew heavy with an unspoken anxiety. A shadow was falling over the fertile valley that cradled redemption and the surrounding ranches. A mysterious affliction, swift and insidious, began to wither crops in the field and strike down livestock. It started subtly, a promising field of wheat showing unexplained discoloration, a prize bull suddenly lethargic. Then it spread with alarming speed. Panic, a seed easily sown in isolated communities, began to take root. Farms that had thrived for years saw their efforts turning to dust. The local veterinarian, a well-meaning but conventional man named Dr. Albright, was overwhelmed and perplexed. He diagnosed various ailments, prescribed expensive patent medicines that did little, and spoke vaguely of unfavorable atmospheric conditions. The blight did not spare Arrowwood Ranch, several of Josiah McBride's prime cattle, animals he'd invested heavily in to improve his herd, sickened. A section of his vital alfalfa crop, essential for winter feed, began to yellow and wilt at an alarming rate. His foreman, a grizzled, experienced rancher named Thomas, was grim-faced. "Never seen the like. Josiah," he'd muttered, shaking his head. "It's like the land itself is cursed." Josiah, a pragmatic man, felt the pressure mounting. Significant financial losses loomed, threatening not just his profits but the livelihoods of the many hands he employed. He listened to Dr. Albright, consulted with other stricken ranchers, but found no clear answers, only a rising sense of helplessness. It was Hannah Lawson who first noticed a pattern others had missed. While tending the kitchen gardens, which by now were flourishing oases of health under her care, she observed the subtle differences in how the blight manifested. She walked the affected fields at Arrowwood, her gaze sharp, her fingers crumbling soil, examining withered leaves, and observing the behavior of afflicted animals with an intensity that went beyond mere concern. She recalled tales from her grandmother, stories of blights and animal sicknesses, and the specific, often overlooked, signs that pointed to their true nature. One afternoon, after days of meticulous observation, she approached Josiah McBride as he surveyed a failing pasture, his face etched with worry. "Mr. McBride," she began, her voice hesitant but firm, "I believe I may have an idea about this sickness." He turned, his brow furrowed. "Dr. Albright is stumped, Hannah. What do you see that he doesn't?" "It's not just one thing, sir," she explained, holding out a carefully collected sample of a small, grayish fungus she'd found growing on the underside of wilted alfalfa leaves, almost invisible to the untrained eye. "And look here, near the water troughs in this pasture." She pointed to a patch of innocuous-looking weeds, some of which had been nibbled by the cattle. "This is nightshade, sir, not usually so prevalent here. But the dry spring followed by these sudden heavy rains, it's made it flourish. And the fungus on the alfalfa, I believe it's a type that releases toxins when the conditions are just so." She went on to explain her theory, a combination of factors, the opportunistic fungus weakening the plants and stressed animals ingesting more of the unusually abundant toxic weeds as other forage became less palatable. Thomas, the foreman, who had walked up, scoffed openly, "Begging your pardon, Mr. McBride, but that's just old wives' tales. Weeds and a bit of mold. This is something serious." Josiah looked from his foreman's skeptical face to Hannah's earnest one. He saw the meticulous samples she had gathered, the careful logic in her explanation, born not from books, but from a deep, intuitive understanding of the land and its delicate balances, the very knowledge Mrs. Thorne had so readily dismissed as folk remedies. He thought of her success with his lambs, the revived gardens. He was facing ruinous losses if something didn't change. "And what do you propose, Hannah?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "For the fields, a specific treatment for the soil using lime and wood ash, and we must carefully remove and burn the affected plants to stop the spores. For the animals, We need to move them to clean pastures immediately. I can prepare a drench of willow bark and other herbs to help cleanse their systems and build their strength, and we must eradicate these weeds meticulously." Thomas looked aghast. "That's a mountain of work, Josiah!" "And pulling animals off good pasture when they're already weak." Josiah McBride stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The established experts offered nothing but expensive failures. Here was an alternative, unconventional, yet presented with a quiet conviction and evidence that, to his increasingly open mind, made a desperate kind of sense. He looked at Hannah, at the unwavering integrity in her eyes. "All right, Hannah," he said finally, his voice resolute, making Thomas's jaw drop. "We'll do it your way. You'll have all the hands you need. Show Thomas what needs to be done." It was a monumental gamble, trusting the largely untested knowledge of a rejected male, order bride, a black woman whose wisdom was rooted in traditions far removed from the accepted practices of the territory, over the pronouncements of the educated men. As Hannah, with a mixture of trepidation and fierce determination, began to outline her plan, she knew she wasn't just fighting a blight on the land, but also the blight of prejudice that sought to keep her and her knowledge in the shadows. The bloom of hope, however, was now firmly planted. The decision to entrust the fate of Arrowwood Ranch to Hannah Lawson's unconventional methods sent ripples of disbelief, not only through the ranch hands, but all the way to redemption. Josiah McBride's orders were clear. However, Hannah was to lead the effort, and she would have whatever resources she required. The days that followed were a blur of relentless activity. Hannah, with Josiah's quiet but unyielding support, directed the ranch hands with a gentle authority that brooked no argument. She showed them how to identify and carefully burn the afflicted plants to prevent the spread of fungal spores, how to prepare the soil treatments she prescribed using lime from the quarry and ash from the ranch's big burn pile. Skepticism was etched on many of the hands' faces initially, particularly older men like Thomas, the foreman, who grumbled about witchery under his breath, though never directly to Josiah. The most immediate task was moving the ailing livestock to fresh, untainted pastures. Hannah then supervised the meticulous clearing of the poisonous nightshade from all grazing lands, a back-breaking task. She herself spent hours gathering specific herbs, willow bark for fever and pain, plantain for its healing properties, yarrow to staunch internal bleeding, she suspected in the weaker animals, preparing potent drenches and poultices. Her small cabin, usually a place of quiet solitude, became a fragrant workshop of drying herbs and simmering concoctions. Mrs. Millicent Thorne, hearing of these activities, was apoplectic. "It's unnatural," she declared to anyone who would listen in town. "She's dosing those poor animals with heaven knows what concoctions from the wayside." Mr. McBride has clearly taken leave of his senses. Someone should intervene before she poisons the entire herd and the land itself. Her words found fertile ground among the fearful and the prejudiced. Edgar Grumbles saw the unfolding crisis as an opportunity. While Hannah toiled, he began to peddle his own miracle cures. To the desperate ranchers in the valley, overpriced bottles of brightly colored liquid that were, in reality, little more than molasses and river water, with a dash of cheap whiskey for effect. He'd loudly proclaim the ineffectiveness of primitive measures being undertaken at Arrowwood, subtly implying Hannah's efforts were not just futile, but dangerous, all while lining his own pockets. "You need proper science, folks," he'd say with a greasy smile, "not superstition." Hannah, though consumed by her work, was not oblivious. She heard the whispers, saw the distrust in some eyes. But she also saw the first, tentative signs of hope. A few of the sickest calves, after receiving her herbal drenches, began to show a flicker of their old energy. The spread of the alfalfa wilt in a test plot she had treated seemed to slow, then halt. She meticulously documented her observations, the ingredients she used, and the effects they had, collecting samples of Grumbles' so-called cure when a desperate smallholder sought her opinion on it. This growing collection of notes and samples became her quiet ammunition. A few of the younger ranch hands, initially wary, started to watch her with a dawning respect. They saw her tireless dedication, her genuine distress over the suffering animals, and the methodical intelligence she brought to every task. One, a young man named Billy, whose favorite cow had been among the worst afflicted, began to actively assist her in gathering herbs, his skepticism replaced by a shy admiration as he saw the cow slowly begin to recover under Hannah's care. These small alliances were like balm to her spirit. Josiah McBride was a constant, reassuring presence. He didn't hover, but he made sure Hannah had everything she needed, from extra manpower to access to his personal library for any reference books that might, even indirectly, support her intuitive knowledge. When a neighboring rancher, influenced by Mrs. Thorne, came to Arrowwood to try and persuade Josiah to abandon Hannah's dangerous experiments, McBride had calmly but firmly shown him the door. "Hannah Lawson knows more about the health of this land and its creatures than any of us," Josiah had stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I trust her judgment." His faith was a shield against the hostility, allowing Hannah to focus on the race against time. The blight was a formidable enemy, but with each small victory, each animal that took a step back towards health, each patch of land that showed signs of healing, Hannah felt her resolve harden. She was not just saving a ranch, she was proving that wisdom could wear many faces, and that truth, like a hardy plant, could push its way through even the stoniest ground of prejudice. The evidence of her success was slowly, steadily accumulating, blade by blade, breath by breath. The agricultural crisis gripping the valley had reached a fever pitch. Desperate ranchers, their livelihoods crumbling, agreed to a town meeting in Redemption's modest town hall, hoping for solutions, or at least a shared strategy. The air was thick with fear and frustration as Josiah McBride, with Hannah Lawson walking quietly but resolutely by his side, entered the crowded room. A hush fell, then a murmur of renewed whispers. Many knew of McBride's controversial decision to entrust his ranch's fate to Hannah. Edgar Grumbles, smelling an opportunity to further ingratiate himself and discredit his rivals, had positioned himself near the front. Mrs. Millicent Thorne sat primly with a coterie of like-minded women, her expression one of stern disapproval as her eyes landed on Hannah. The meeting began with bleak reports from several ranchers. Dr. Albright offered his apologies, admitting he was baffled by the tenacity of the blight. It was then that Edgar Grumbles seized his moment. He rose, his voice oozing false sympathy. "Gentlemen, it's a tragedy, a true tragedy!" And while some resort to unproven, even dangerous methods, he cast a pointed look towards Hannah and Josiah. "I have been working tirelessly to provide a scientifically formulated remedy. He held up a bottle of his brightly colored elixir. Grumbles' golden solution, guaranteed to restore vigor. Mrs. Thorne then stood, her voice sharp. Indeed. And I must say it is deeply concerning that Mr. McBride, a leading citizen, has chosen to endanger his property, and by extension, potentially the entire valley, by relying on folk charms and the dabblings of an unqualified woman. Perhaps this blight was even exacerbated by such interference. The room buzzed. Accusations hung heavy in the air. Before Josiah could speak, Hannah, seeing the tide of uninformed opinion turning against them, felt a surge of courage. This was not just about Arrowwood anymore. It was about truth. Josiah, however, placed a calming hand on her arm and then rose to his full height, his presence commanding immediate silence. Gentlemen, his voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. You have all heard opinions. Now, let me present you with facts. He proceeded to lay out, with precise detail, the state of Arrowwood Ranch before Hannah Lawson had intervened, the dying cattle, the wilting fields, the same despair many in the room were currently experiencing. Then he described the systematic approach Hannah had taken, the long hours, the meticulous care, and the results. He paused, letting his words sink in. As of this morning, Arrowwood Ranch has lost no more cattle to this blight since Miss Lawson began her work. Our affected alfalfa fields are showing new, healthy growth. Our animals are recovering. The methods are perhaps unconventional to some, but they are undeniably effective. He then turned his gaze to Grumbles. Mr. Grumbles speaks of science. I, too, believe in evidence. He produced a small, stoppered bottle containing a murky liquid. This is Grumbles' golden solution, purchased by one of my hands. I had it examined. Its primary ingredients, gentlemen, are water, molasses, and a trace of cheap rye whiskey. It has no medicinal properties whatsoever for blight or animal sickness. A gasp went through the room. Grumbles' face turned a mottled purple. That's a lie! Slander. Eyes it, Mr. Grumbles. Josiah continued, his voice like ice. Perhaps Miss Lawson can enlighten us further. All eyes turned to Hannah. She stepped forward, no longer hesitant. In her hands, she held her notebook and several carefully prepared samples. Her voice, though quiet, filled the room with its clarity and conviction. The blight, she began, is complex. It involves a specific fungal agent that thrives in these unusual weather conditions, and its effects are worsened when livestock, seeking forage, consume an increased amount of certain toxic plants, like the nightshade that has become overly abundant this season. She displayed her samples of the fungus, the pressed nightshade, explaining its properties. My methods are not magic, Mrs. Thorne. They are based on generations of observation, understanding how to restore balance to the soil and support the animal's natural healing capabilities using specific herbs that counteract toxins and bolster immunity. She then addressed Grumbles' solution. What Mr. Grumbles is selling, she said, holding up her own analysis, will do nothing for your animals or your land. In fact, relying on it will only delay proper treatment and allow the blight to worsen, while he profits from your desperation. Just then, Billy, the young ranch hand from Arrowwood whose cow Hannah had saved, stood up nervously from the back. It's true, he called out. My Bess was near death. Miss Lawson, she brought her back. I seen it with my own eyes. She knows what she's doing. Another small farmer, a quiet man named Peters, whom Hannah had discreetly advised after seeing his distress, also rose. Miss Lawson shared some of her knowledge with me. My small herd, they're improving too. She asked for nothing in return. The tide had turned. The evidence was undeniable, corroborated by first-hand accounts. Edgar Grumbles sputtered, his bluster deflating. Mrs. Millicent Thorne sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of stunned indignation, her pronouncements suddenly hollow. The ranchers began to talk amongst themselves, not with fear, but with a newfound interest, looking at Hannah with respect, even awe. The reckoning at redemption was swift and decisive. Hannah Lawson, armed with truth and the undeniable results of her skill, had not only exposed a fraud, but had also shattered the prejudiced assumptions that had sought to silence her. The path to recovery for the valley was suddenly, unexpectedly, illuminated by her quiet wisdom. The fallout from the town meeting was immediate and transformative. Edgar Grumbles, exposed as a charlatan and a profiteer, found his mercantile boycotted. The whispers that had once followed Hannah Lawson now clung to him, heavy with derision and contempt. Within a month, facing financial ruin and social ostracism, Grumbles sold his failing business for a pittance and departed redemption on the same stagecoach that had brought Hannah. His exit as ignominious as her arrival had been fraught with peril. Mrs. Millicent Thorne's reign as redemption's moral arbiter crumbled. Her pronouncements, once received as gospel by a certain segment of the town, now sounded like the shrill biased judgments they were. While some of her staunchest supporters remained, her broader influence was irrevocably diminished. She retreated into a disgruntled silence, her power to dictate social acceptance broken by the clear evidence of Hannah's competence and integrity. For Hannah Lawson, life blossomed. The respect she had earned was palpable. Ranchers from across the valley, initially hesitant, began to seek her advice, not with suspicion, but with genuine hope. She shared her knowledge freely, teaching them about soil health, plant identification, and the herbal remedies that could support their livestock. Slowly, methodically, the blight that had threatened to destroy their livelihoods began to recede, replaced by the green shoots of recovery, cultivated by wisdom that had once been dismissed. At Arrowwood Ranch, Josiah McBride watched Hannah with a deepening admiration that went far beyond her agricultural acumen. He saw her grace, her unwavering moral compass, her quiet strength that had faced down injustice and ignorance without resorting to bitterness. He saw the life returning, not just to his land and animals, but also to his own solitary existence. The ranch, once just a well-run enterprise, felt more like a home with Hannah there, vibrant and alive. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun cast long shadows over fields now healthy and abundant, Josiah found Hannah by the creek, sketching in a small notebook the plants she had cataloged. "Hannah," he began, his usual reserve softened by an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "What you've done for Arrowwood, for this whole valley, it's remarkable." She smiled a genuine, radiant expression. "I only shared what I knew, Josiah. The land and the animals did the real work of healing." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But you showed us the way. Arrowwood needs that guidance, permanently. I want to offer you the position of, well, manager of agricultural health and innovation for the entire ranch. You would have full authority to implement your methods, to experiment, to teach. To make this place a beacon of sustainable farming." Hannah's heart swelled. It was more than she could have dreamed, a role that not only recognized her skills, but empowered her to use them to their fullest. But there's more, Josiah continued, taking a step closer, his gaze earnest. This ranch, it's vast, and at times, it has been a lonely place. You've brought not just healing to the land, Hannah, but also a different kind of light into my life. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. The advertisement Grumbles placed was for a bride. He didn't deserve you, but I find myself hoping that the man who does see you, truly sees you for the incredible woman you are, might be me. You are, in every way that matters, the perfect partner I never thought I'd find to cultivate not just this land, but a life. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, not of sorrow, but of profound joy and a sense of finally, truly, belonging. She had arrived in redemption, rejected and alone, her worth denied. Now, she stood as a respected leader, her talents celebrated, and was being offered not just a position, but a partnership, a love that saw all of her. Yes, Josiah, she whispered, her hand closing around his. Yes to all of it. Elara Vance's correction, Hannah Lawson's journey from a rejected outsider to the respected heart of Arrowwood Ranch, and a catalyst for change in redemption serves as a powerful reminder that true worth often lies where it's least expected, and that courage, wisdom, and skill can bloom even in the harshest of environments. If this story of resilience and the fight for justice stirred something in you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives about people who turned adversity into triumph. What was the most impactful moment for you?